Every week, I whisper to you about a different horror movie that I love. Or, in the month of November, a movie that you love. Because, as you probably know, we are smack dab in the middle of viewer request month. A couple of things first. As with the video from a few weeks ago, I have a dog in the room with me. He wants to be in here with me while I'm recording. This is my own dog, Hank. Last time it was a dog that I was watching, a friend's dog, but now it's Hank. The love of my life. I mean, my wife is the love of my life, but our pride and joy, as it were. And so I'm saying that in case you hear any scratching or weird licking sounds. Dogs can get noisy. I took his collar off, so hopefully we won't hear anything too jarring, like jingling or whatever. He's just asleep on the couch right now. Hank is in here with me. I didn't want to leave him alone because he gets lonely sometimes and he wanted to be here in my office with me. And also, it's very appropriate that Hank is in here with me because today we are talking about 1989's Pet Sematary. Not the one from a couple years ago. 1989's Pet Sematary, the original, the OG Pet Sematary. I should say that I actually really like the Pet Sematary that came out a couple years ago. I know it's very polarizing when you talk to Stephen King fans or horror fans, but I really love it. I actually think that the one from a couple years ago tackles the topic of grief and explaining death to children in a much more complex way than this one does. I love them both, but I just wanted to throw that out there. I quite like the one from a couple years ago, and I quite like this one. And this request comes to us from Anthony Westendorf. Anthony, thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for requesting this film. I said this last time, or I've said this in the past couple of viewer requests. Y'all have great taste. If someone had requested a film that I didn't love, I still would have done it, but so far we have Evil Dead, Color Out of Space, and now Pet Sematary. All films which I love. I actually probably love Pet Sematary the most out of those three films. No surprise from both the buttons on my jacket, and if any of you know me from the Losers Club, a Stephen King podcast, I'm a huge Stephen King fan. I mean, look at the shelf behind me. He's my favorite author. I've been obsessed with him for pretty much my entire life. So Anthony, you probably knew I was gonna like Pet Sematary, right? So thank you for requesting it. Part of why I'm also really excited to talk about this film is on the Losers Club, we cover all things Stephen King in chronological order, and I actually wasn't on the Pet Sematary book episode or the movie episode, and we actually interviewed the director, Lambert, and I wasn't on that either. I did get to interview the cast and crew of the new film that came out a couple years ago at South by Southwest, but that's the most Pet Sematary interaction I've had on the podcast, so I'm really excited to talk about this 1989 film, which is a very formative horror movie for me. So, we've got the preamble out of the way. The only thing left to do is to talk about the film, right? Another very simple premise from the Master of Horror. The Creeds are a family that moved from Chicago to Maine. I can't remember if they might be moving from Boston in the film. I don't know. That doesn't matter. Point is, they're moving from the city to the country. The father, Lewis Creed, is a doctor, a physician at the local hospital at the college. And his family, his wife Rachel, his daughter Ellie, and his son Gage, and of course their cat Church, aka Winston Churchill. Shortly after they move in, they befriend a kindly old neighbor, Judd Crandall, played by Fred Gwynne of the Munsters. And as they know this new community. Fred Judd introduces them to a pet cemetery where children bury their pets, but beyond the pet cemetery is a Native American Micmac burial ground. And we eventually discover that if you bury things in there, in the rotten soil, they can come back, but not quite like you would want or think. They almost come back as, I want to say, cannibals, zombies, some kind of evil. The point being they're not what you thought they were when you buried them, or not what they were when they were alive. And so both the film and the book are meditations on grief and the acceptance of death, and how we are so reluctant to accept death sometimes. I mean, it's a cliche to say it, but we have the 5 stages of grief, right, which I think vary, and there's probably some more nuance in there, but I think the 5 that I remember are denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. That's only 4. What am I missing? The point is, I think the movie deals with both, and the book deal with the denial and the bargaining stages of grief. As the deaths get worse and worse in the movie, it starts off with Ellie's beloved cat, Church, which Lewis buries, and then eventually extends to his 2-year-old son who gets run over by a truck, and then his own wife. As we go along, I feel like that is Lewis increasingly trying to bargain with death. And it's interesting because him and his wife have 2 very different views on death in the film and the book. Rachel is more disturbed, and I think unaccepting of it because of a really traumatic episode with her sister who died when she was young, and we'll get to that. It's the scariest part of the movie. Whereas Lewis, he's a man of science, he's a medical professional, he's much more realistic when it comes to death. Early on, we see a patient of his, not even a patient, it's essentially a guy a jogger who got hit by a truck come in, and Lewis tries to save him and he can't, and he watches this young man succumb very rapidly to a head injury, and he eventually becomes somewhat of a spirit guide throughout the movie, the moral force of the movie, the force of good. So right away we see Lewis already having to deal with death and accept death. And what's interesting about it is, as the bodies pile up, Lewis actually becomes the one, I think, who is trying to cheat death or bargain with death when he buries the cat at the urging of Judd, his neighbor. He's trying to prevent his daughter from having to accept the realism of death, although Lewis doesn't have as much of an emotional connection to the cat. He is trying to stall things, right? He's trying to bargain, he's trying to delay having to have a tough conversation with his daughter. Then when his son gets killed, it's an even worse and more severe version of bargaining. Lewis does have more of an emotional acceptance, or a connection to his son Gage, so he's trying to actively reverse the clock, make this not happen. He's trying to bargain, even though that's impossible, because like I said, once you bury the person or the animal in the pet cemetery, or beyond the pet cemetery rather, in the Micmac burial ground, they are no longer the same person. They're almost a mockery of what they were before. They might be able to imitate how the person talked or acted when they were alive a little bit, but ultimately these are creatures of ill intent. These are creatures of murder, of cannibalism. They're almost like demonic versions of the being that you once knew. So I think about that a lot, how we have this man who is almost stubbornly rational about death when the movie starts, and we see that rationale start to fade away, and he starts to give in to his worst impulses, and he's almost stubbornly fighting against accepting death. And I get that. The people in my life who have died, like anyone, I don't want it to happen. When it happens, I don't like it when it happens. You try and think of all the ways you can reverse it, and you just can't. Death is it's one of the only universal things about all of us, right? We're all born, we all die. How we die is another question, and when we die is another question, but it happens to all of us at some point. And I understand where Lewis is coming from in this story. It's one thing to have your grandparent who's in their 80s die of natural causes. It's another thing to have your 2-year-old boy get mercilessly run over by a truck. So I totally get the impulse to not want to accept this, to feel like you're being cosmically made fun of or abused by having the thing you love in your life get taken away at such an early age. I mean, that's why this story is so tragic in many ways. It's funny, I don't have children. I have nieces and nephews who I love very much, and that's about as close as we are to having kids right now. And I've always really loved Pet Sematary. It's one of my favorite King stories, and it's always hit me really hard. But I don't have a problem rereading it. I mean, I always feel a little depressed after I'm done, because it's a true tragedy, as such a tragic ending. But I always come back to it. I love the writing. It's legit scary for both thematic and aesthetic reasons, which we'll get into. But I wouldn't say I have a hard time reading it. I usually finish it pretty quickly every time I revisit it. But my friends who have kids who have revisited it, they have told me they have such a hard time reading it now as a parent with children. One of my professors in grad school was rereading Pet Sematary, and he really loved it because he loves reading stories about grief, and he loves what the novel has to say about grief. But he said rereading it now that he has 2 kids was such a painful experience, and I get it. So I'm always interested to hear people's thoughts on this book after they've had, they have children of their own. Even Stephen King has said that looking back and rereading it, he admires it as a book. I think he knows how strong it is, but I don't want to say he wishes he never wrote it, but he's talked about that, how he wouldn't write something like that now. And it's funny because he had all 3 of his children by the time he wrote Pet Sematary, but he said that looking back, he feels like it's a miserable book. I mean, it is. Nothing good comes of it. And he wrote the adaptation for the film. He's in the film too. He has a cameo as a minister at Gage's funeral. So he's very close to the novel. I think he recognizes its strengths. He recognizes how it's made a good film, but he also, I think, knows that was a very dark part of himself that wrote it. But I think those also make for the best stories sometimes, when as someone who writes stories themselves, some of my best work is the work where I look at it and maybe I'm a little put off or disturbed by it, and I can't pinpoint where it came from. It almost feels like it comes from this subconscious part of you. Not all good stories are like that. Some of them are very meticulous, very plotted out, and come from a very mechanical part of your brain. But every now and then you get a story that is, like I said, just completely subconscious, I think, and comes from such a place of viscera and raw emotion. And for me, Pet Sematary is one of those stories. I don't know if Stephen King could write that nowadays. I think it had to come from a very specific place and time for him. Alright, so we've talked a lot about the thematic, darker implications of this film and this movie. But something I love about it too is that it also thrills on just a very spooky, ooky, pleasurable, scary level, right? And those are my favorite kind of horror films. We talk a lot about prestige horror nowadays. Films like Hereditary and Midsommar and The Lodge, all these, Neon, A24, Amazon Studios type horror movies, which I'm a huge fan of those. But there's this big debate in the horror community, I think, of prestige horror versus horror that's purely aesthetically driven. Now, I would argue that those films are scary on just a visual and audio and sensory level too, right? I think they do check all those boxes, but I think because of their length, because of their experimentation, their just overall unconventionality, I totally see a lot of viewers find them to be too academic, too stodgy, to really get scared by them, even though I do get scared by them. So when I think of a film like Pet Pet Sematary that's not even 2 hours long. It gets at these bigger questions about death and the acceptance of death and grief, but it also just gets at some really raw scares. I think that's a really nice sweet spot. There's an accessibility to the film, even though it deals with some of the darkest events in the Stephen King canon. And I think that's because as soon as the creeds arrive, there's something just off about everything. And I don't mean they're finding bodies in the attic or something. I mean everything is just slightly left of center. Something I love about Mary Lambert's direction is she just puts in these little touches that are just very, very strange. For instance, something I think about is when we see Victor Pascal, who's the jogger who gets killed, we go right from this just idyllic family scene to them talking about death around a breakfast table, and it's I mean, they're talking about death, but it's cozy, right? We're seeing the scene of domestic bliss, and it just cuts right to, oh, there's my dog Hank. He's scratching his lip. He doesn't like Tammy talking about the Pet Cemetery. But we go right from idyllic countryside family time to a close-up of this jogger with a vicious head wound. Now, that's where that scene happens in the book too, right? So in many ways, Mary Lambert and Stephen King are just following the chronology of the book. But what I mean by just things seeming off and everything feeling disrupted is that we don't go from the breakfast table to a guy running, to him getting hit by a truck, to him getting hauled into the hospital. We don't even go right from the breakfast table to a crowd surrounding this guy. We skip all the way to the hospital, and not only that, we skip to seeing a graphic close-up of this head wound. That to me is such a bold choice for it being that early on in the movie. It's just a slightly off-kilter way to do things, and I think it is so effective. It just shows us that this is a film that is not behaving itself, and that it is going to go to that raw and dark place very early on. And I think it's just this tonal clarification. It tonally clarifies where we're at with this, and I don't know if you've never seen the film before, I feel like that Victor Pascal scene is probably a good indicator of whether or not you're going to stick around. I also think a lot about just the Maine setting. They actually filmed this in Maine. Stephen King was very insistent upon that this can't be filmed in LA or anywhere else and be made to look like Maine. This has to be in bucolic, sylvan, rural Maine, and it really does go a long way because the Creed property, the Crandall property, I mean, it's very beautiful and peaceful in many ways, but it has this highway cutting through it where trucks are just blazing down every second. So it's this very peaceful setting interrupted nonstop by pure destruction, which of course ends up renting familial destruction once Gage gets hit. When I lived in McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania, it was very much like that. We lived in this really nice big house on the top of a hill in the mountains, but right below us was this major highway, and it was always this weird, scary reminder of industrialization, how fast and awful the world can be sometimes. I was only 6, but I remember playing at the top of this hill and thinking everything was great, but if I looked just over, I would see these trucks barreling down the highway, and it was just a reminder that things could end at every second. Once again, it's that off-kilterness that Mary Lambert's so good at portraying, and just always reminding us that death is around the corner. And the first death, after Pascal, the first death we see is of Church the cat. And I'll have to go back and listen to the Losers Club episode. I wonder if we asked her about this, but not to get morbid, but, well, what am I saying? We're talking about Pet Sematary, we have to get morbid. I have no idea how Mary Lambert filmed all the dead cat shots in this film. So when we see Church, I mean, I guess that's probably just a stuffed animal or something, or some kind of mannequin when we find Church kind of frozen to the ground. But as we go on, once Church gets reanimated and Lewis eventually realizes everything that's going on, has to kill him, we see him injecting the cat with some kind of medical solution to kill him, and then we see the cat sort of coming to a halt on the ground, and it looks like they're using a real cat. I'm sure they could have used some kind of retractable fake needle for the actual injection, but Lewis gets very rough with the cat, and when he puts it on the ground, I mean, it really does look like it's dying. I'm sure they didn't kill a cat for the movie, but I was watching that and just wondering how they got the cat both to be so creepy, but also to give this very convincing death performance. Maybe they shot it in reverse or something. I'm not sure. Thinking about these more macabre elements in the movie and just how off kilter they feel. Something else I noticed this time, and I'd kind of forgotten about it, even though I've seen this film a lot, is when Lewis is going to bury Gage after Gage gets killed, and he's trying to bring him back. In the novel, some of you may have read it, there's a lot of business about once you get past the actual Pet Sematary, you have to climb up all this ragged and rough terrain to get to the Micmac burial ground, and a big element of the novel is the Wendigo, which is a spirit beast in both Canada and northeastern United States, that essentially is supposed to invade people and make them cannibalistic. They don't really go into that in the movie. In the book, it's implied that that's what takes over people once they get buried in the Micmac burial ground. So when they come back, there's this kind of embodiment of the Wendigo. They don't mention the Wendigo in the movie per se, but Lewis sees this weird blue light and hears a kind of bellowing, strange sound in the trees. And in the novel, you hear growling. I mean, it's really coming down hard on the idea that he's encountering the Wendigo. In the movie, though, they have Judd's face form out of these rocks and kind of shoot up from this quarry that he passes. It's very strange. As an effect, it doesn't really line up with anything else we see in the film. It's definitely the wackiest effect, both in how it looks and what is happening, that we encounter in this movie. It's almost like something you would see in a film like Poltergeist. But I love it. I love how off it is. It feels totally bananas and out of nowhere, and yet it really works. It's once again just going to this idea that something is not right in this little pocket of Maine. And then Gage's death in general. So the death of Gage is very melodramatic, I will say. He's playing with a kite, he's hanging out with the Creeds and Judd Crandall, and they turn their back and he starts chasing this kite right into the highway. And it's this truck driver who's driving and listening to the Ramones. Sheena is a punk rocker. And I don't even know how they shot this, because the truck comes to a halt and Miko Hughes, the little kid who plays Gage, you may recognize him from Full House and Spawn and Kindergarten Cop. He stops and he looks at the truck, and the truck screeches to a halt and still hits him. Now, on film, it looks like the truck is getting so close to Miko Hughes, and I don't think they used any kind of stunt person. I mean, it looks like Miko Hughes just standing and looking at a truck. I'm sure they filmed it slow and then just sped it up, or they used some kind of forced perspective, so he's not as close to the vehicle as you think, but it looks like this 2-year-old is so close to this truck that's about to run him over, much like the cat scene. Anyway, so this happens. Lewis, played by Dale Midkiff, who I think is great. He's just great at playing this reactionary character. He's not a character that really necessarily drives the narrative. Things just happen to him and he responds to them, and I love seeing Dale Midkiff just kind of freak out throughout the film. Anyway, when Gage gets hit, he literally screams "No!" to the heavens, and we flash through all these pictures of Gage, and then once we go to his funeral, Lewis gets into a fight with Rachel's father to the point where they deck each other and they knock over the coffin, and Gage's body comes out a little bit. Now, when I was younger, my friends and I, as much as we loved the movie, we would make fun of that whole stretch of events because they're so over the top. From Lewis screaming "No" to the flashing of the pictures to the fight at the funeral to Gage's body spilling out, it's a bit much, it's a bit extra, right? But I don't know, watching it this time and the past few times I've watched it, I don't get bothered by it because A, it is such a horrible event. The death of a child, there's nothing more disturbing and awful to me. So I feel like the movie earns that in a sense. And also, having been to my fair share of funerals, I think people just act really over the top and kooky for a good reason, right? They're processing these emotions and they almost let it come out in this external performative ritual of grief as opposed to actually addressing their feelings. Like I said, in many ways, Lewis is not accepting his son's death, but he feels comfortable getting into a fist fight over it. It's strange when you think about it. It's almost like everything he can't accept is pouring out in this very kinetic, external, alarming kind of way. So rewatching it, I don't mind that the movie is maybe a little bit over the top. I mean, it's an over the top story, but and like I said, death is so extreme. It's such an extreme thing to happen, and people react to it in extreme ways. So it really didn't bother me. I actually think it contributes to the disturbing elements of the movie. But speaking of disturbing, we have to talk about Zelda. So, I mean, that's unanimous, right? I don't think there are anyone I know who loves this movie or has seen this movie. There's plenty of creepiness to go around, but Zelda takes the cake, right? This is Rachel's sister who, oh gosh, I can't even remember now. Was it spinal meningitis or multiple sclerosis? When she was a kid. Either way, Zelda had some horrible illness that eventually took her life when she was a teenager, and Rachel was forced to take care of her. And she actually ended up, I think, dying while Rachel's parents were out. And so it's this really messed up thing that her parents made her take care of her ailing sister. Apologize that I'm probably getting the illness wrong, so I'm not trying to lump all those things into one category. I can't remember off the top of my head what Zelda had. So we see this flashback of young Rachel having to take care of her older sister, which is sad in itself, right? And I don't know how realistic Mary Lambert and her team went with making the effects of this disease look real, but that doesn't bother me. Once again, it goes back to this idea of everything just being off and skewed and off kilter. So Mary Lambert actually had a very lean, thin, grown man play this teenage girl. Now, there's a debate to be had, right, about equity when it comes to casting. Oh, should we give a woman's part to a man like that? But for me, it's not even as much about the gender. It's just putting someone who physically, just in height and stature and build, does not match with what we would think of a teenage girl looking like, and that just contributing to the surreal, very disturbing, very macabre idea of what Zelda looked like. And I actually find myself wondering, I wonder if in this story, if Zelda actually looked like that when she was sick, or we're more seeing young Rachel's perception of that and the exaggeration of that. I think when we're little kids and we see sickness and death, we make it more grotesque in our minds than it maybe really is. We blow it a little bit more out of proportion, and for good reason. And so for me, Mary Lambert casting this man, I want to say his name was Andrew Hubestek. I looked this up before we started. He was a theater actor, and I've seen pictures of him. He just looks like a tall, lean guy, but under Zelda's makeup and hair and everything, and this green nightgown and these rippling back effects, he looks really, really scary. And it goes back to what I was saying about Jaws. Because it doesn't look quite realistic, that's almost scarier to me. It's a nightmare version of an already nightmarish situation. So we see Zelda in flashbacks, and that's freaky enough. And then once Gage comes back and Rachel is trying to make her way back to the property from visiting her parents, she can just sense something is wrong. When she encounters Gage, who has become this little demonic, cannibalistic, reanimated 2-year-old. She actually sees Zelda at first, and I think the most disturbing shot of the movie is she enters this room. It's in the Crandall house, and Zelda is crouched in the corner, and Mary Lambert shoots it from this weird angle. It's not a Dutch angle, but it's once again that forced perspective thing. She shoots it in a way where Zelda actually looks really small at first, and then she gets up and rushes towards the camera, and suddenly she looks huge. She looks tall. It's like an Alice in Wonderland expansion shot, and it is so freaky, just the scope of this diseased demonic figure ballooning out of nowhere. And it wasn't done with digital effects. Like I said, I don't know how she did it. I think it's some just kind of angle. I'm not a filmmaker, some kind of angular forced perspective thing, but it just goes from 0 to 60 within 2 seconds like that. And Rachel sees it, and then she sees Gage again. And what's interesting, and I didn't notice this until way later, many years after I first saw the movie, when Gage finally approaches her, his hair is now red, like Zelda's, and he's in this same kind of nightgown that Zelda's been wearing. Early in the movie, we see a picture of what Zelda looked like when she was Gage's age, and she has this nightgown, and she has this little top hat and a cane, and Gage has all those things. So it's this weird combination of Gage and Zelda, which is both horrific but also appealing to Rachel. She gets to see her little boy come back, but he's also commingled with this very exaggerated vision of what her sister was like when she was dying. Anyway, I feel like I could do a whole episode about Zelda. I mean, just the way that Mary Lambert forces the person who should not be in a high school girl's body into her body, and then with all the makeup on top of it, everything just feels really nauseous and not quite right. It's the scariest part of the movie for me. And then also, as we kind of wrap up talking about the moments in Pet Sematary that scare me the most, there are a lot of little mundane things that maybe weren't even designed to be scary, but they actually scare me a lot. So part of what I think of is when Lewis goes to Crandall's house, and he sees that Judd has been killed by Gage by like a slicing of his Achilles heel and getting his mouth and throat gnawed open. And he sees that Gage has killed his wife, Rachel, also. He drops her from the attic and she's hanging. Lewis decides to end the life of Gage, who he just brought back, and he does it in the same manner as Church. He injects him with, I don't know if it's cyanide or some kind of whatever drugs he has in his medical bag. So he does this. And once he does inject the poison, Miko Hughes just kind of goes back to being normal Gage. He looks at the camera and he says, "No fair." He starts talking like a kid again, which is disturbing because now you're seeing non-demonic Gage have to die all over again, right? I mean, he's still demonic Gage, but he doesn't have all the weird, freaky external stuff that he had just a minute ago. And Miko Hughes just walks around a little bit and stumbles and falls on his butt and hits his head, and then he dies. And maybe Miko Hughes just did that because he was a little 2 or 3 year old kid. Little 2 and 3 year old kids always fall down when they walk. But I mean, it looks like he's really hurting himself. He stumbles and he falls and hits his head. It looks so realistic, and it always is disturbing to me because it's just a weird series of emotions, seeing this kid going from acting really feral and demonic to normal again is scary in itself. And then the fall just looks really painful, and so then I think about how they shot that. I have no idea. It's just really effective. Mary Lambert has this way of shooting people falling and stumbling that really gets to me. And then the other instance of that I think is, I mean, it's almost funny how painful it looks, is after all these events have happened, Lewis has gone and buried Rachel in hopes of reanimating her. The logic being that he waited too long to bury Gage, and that maybe if he buries Rachel within, minutes, hours of her dying, she might come back and be be normal. So he does that, and then he goes to bed. This is the very end of the movie, and he wakes up, and he falls out of bed and just bangs his head really hard on the nightstand. And I think a lot about, what are the most painful things I've seen in cinema history? What are the things on screen that really disturb me? And sometimes the most mundane injuries can feel really painful. I think about in The Big Lebowski, where the Malibu sheriff throws his coffee mug at Jeff Bridges' head and it hits him, and it just, the sound effect and just the angle looks so painful. This moment of Lewis hitting his head on the nightstand is similar to me. It's not especially horrific. It's not especially out of the ordinary, but maybe that's what makes it so scary. It's just this very mundane injury that looks super realistic. So yeah, I don't know if that was an instance of Dale Midkiff just waking up and really hitting his head and they decided to use it because it was effective, or if Mary Lambert directed him to do that and they used some kind of trick photography to make it look really good. So then we get into the ending of the movie. Now, this is my one criticism of Pet Sematary. I'd be curious to hear if the rest of you have this too. So in the book, we have this kind of epilogue where Lewis is at the table. It's late at night. He hears the church bells ring, and his wife, Rachel, well, I should say it's Denise Crosby in the movie, and she's excellent. Just kind of combining trying to be rational with also being really fearful. I feel like her and Dale Midkiff both have their work cut out for them in this movie, and they both really arrive and meet it. Anyway, in the book, Rachel enters the door, and I think Stephen King describes it as a voice choked with dirt, which I thought was a great way to describe how a dead person might talk. And I think she says love her or something similar, and she sort of beckons Lewis to go to her, and she does. And that's it. That's where we end. Now, we obviously know it's probably not going to go well for Lewis. I'm sure she's going to kill him or do something. I mean, at the end of the day, this is not his wife. This is the Wendigo demon hybrid of who his wife used to be. But I like the slight ambiguity. It's a little bit, it's still, it's spooky, it's haunting, it's eerie. We just have this man going and approaching his reanimated wife, who is crawling with dirt and maggots and whatever else. And apparently Stephen King and Mary Lambert wanted to end a movie like that too, but this studio, I think it was Paramount, they felt like because of all the slasher movies that were popular and coming out, they needed something a little bit more of a punch. They wanted to end it a little bit more like a traditional horror movie. They needed something a little bit grosser. So it still ends the same, but we see the moment of him going to Rachel and actually kissing her, and that doesn't bother me. It's super gross. Denise Crosby has all this brown fluid leaking out of her eye, and I think you see some bugs in there. And so when they kiss, I would be fine if they ended it with that. But this is the part I don't like. As they kiss, it goes into slow motion, and you see her grab a knife and go to stab him. Then we cut to black, and we hear Lewis screaming. Now, and like I said, that's probably what happens in the book, right? I don't think it ends well for Lewis after he goes to his reanimated cannibal Wendigo wife. But there's something classier and mysterious, and I think more scary by ending before we get to the moment where she actually kills him. And in this, it just feels a little crass. It feels a little bit over the top. It feels a little bit not in line with the rest of the movie. It doesn't make me not like it, of course not. I adore this movie, but I always wish it just ended with Rachel entering and Lewis looking up and smiling, and then cut to black, cut to the Ramones song, Pet Sematary. Oh, and we should talk about that. I'm a huge Ramones fan, but I've never really liked the song Pet Sematary. It's just a little goofy. It falls into what I call list songs. Rob Zombie does these a lot, where it's just a list of macabre imagery. You know, it's just like, oh, demons and goblins, and there's tombstones, then there's this, then there's this, then there's this. I don't want to be buried in a pet cemetery. It doesn't really go anywhere lyrically. Arc-wise, it doesn't have much going on. It's just like a laundry list of spooky stuff. So I used to feel that way about the song, but every year my wife and I throw a big Halloween party. Not this year, obviously, but all of the years we do. And I feel like when you throw a Christmas party, you have so many songs to choose from as far as what should be on a Christmas playlist. With Halloween, there aren't quite as many staples. I find myself often putting Chromatics or other bands that maybe aren't necessarily talking about the holiday or spooky stuff, but their music feels spooky. I have to go a little bit more towards that to fill out a 6 to 8 hour playlist. So I've come to really appreciate the songs that have become considered Halloween staples. So I put A Spell on You, Thriller, of course, and Pet Sematary by the Ramones. Even though I think the lyrics are a little silly and ineffective, I love that they have their own Halloween novelty song in a way. I really respect that they went there and that they've created a piece of music that is now a staple of the holiday. Anyway, that is Pet Sematary. I feel like I could talk for 20 more minutes about this film and just Stephen King and the book in general. But, I think we've been going about 40 minutes, so I want to respect your time. You might be asleep now, or maybe you're sitting up, wrapped with attention, listening to me talk still, hearing my great analysis of this film. So, as far as the next 2 weeks go, I realized that we actually have not 5 weeks in November, but we have like 5 Mondays in November, so technically we have 5 episodes we could do for viewer request month. However, I thought of one Thanksgiving-ish, horror-ish film that I know I want to do. So, the next episode you see will be the Monday before Thanksgiving. I'm going to do this movie, which is not one that anyone's requested so far, but I'm going to do this movie. And then the final Monday in November, I think it's the 30th, that will be our final viewer request. So if you have something you want to hear me talk about, still let me know. First come, first serve as always. I promise I'll get to it. But know that next week is going to be something that I'm picking, and I think you'll all like it too. It's one of the few Thanksgiving horror options out there, and I think it should be a lot of fun. But if you have something you want to see me cover, like I said, drop it in the comments, shoot me an email, or DM me over socials. I check that stuff all throughout the day. I'll get back to you, I promise. So, that's that. I guess next weekend would be the time to wish you happy Thanksgiving, but I'll say it now too. Or if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you're finding some restoration and rest as we really go into the holiday season. And 2020's been a wild year, to say the least, but I'm hoping we're coming out of it on the other end with some positivity and maybe some great changes to the world. So I hope wherever you are that you are happy and healthy and safe. And even if you aren't, that's okay too. It's been a rough go of it, I know. So until I see you next week, get some sleep. Don't have nightmares, except for the good kind. We'll see you then.